this talk, don't get hung up on the title. For those of you that know the poem, I'm not going to try to spin a yarn about how someone needs to be walking the earth in penance for forever. This is mostly just a fun play on words. So we're going to talk about where water is, how much can be used for dairy, and I'm coming at this from a different angle. There's been a lot of interesting talks from people that really know what's happening on farms. And I should say, I've never been on a dairy farm. I've been close to them. I've talked to people that have been on dairy farms. But I'm coming at this from a different angle, which is kind of neat. So hopefully it'll add to the discussion and provide some ground for fertile talks later. So obviously I need to acknowledge co-authors. Olivier Joliet was my postdoctoral advisor at Michigan, and Ann and Martin worked with us also at Michigan. Okay, so milk is kind of interesting because it integrates. The cow serves as an integrating function. It takes a lot of food from across the country and produces milk. And then we have our distribution system that further integrates the output of those cows to produce what we sort of refer to in this talk as national milk. Obviously, there's not a glass of milk that you can drink that is truly representative with the fraction of milk coming from Michigan and California that corresponds to that which happens across the country. But we talk about sort of a national kilo of milk. And yesterday we heard from Dr. Hoekstra about sort of looking at all these different stages of production, and this is a nice framework to think about complex systems, which I'm arguing that milk is. We've got all these different feeds, we've got all these different spaces where milk is being produced, and it's a complex system, even if you exclude that spatial factor. So this, I just went to waterfootprint.org last night and found this, and I couldn't find the exact slide that Hoekstra used, but he talked about direct and indirect water use. And this is an important thing in the sort of framework that I've been operating in, which is called life cycle assessment. I'm sure many of you know it, but briefly, the idea is that you trace something all the way from extraction of the raw materials you need through use, et cetera, to disposal, and you get a sort of systems perspective of the product or service in question. And it allows you to say things like, for those of us who don't use Febreze to wash our clothes, if you use your washing machine, the majority of the water associated with your cotton shirt is from washing it and not from the production of the cotton. So this is the sort of thing that LCA helps you figure out. And so we're talking about dairy, and so here's the sort of life cycle of dairy. We've got feed, we've got cows, there's all the transport, the retail, the consumer has to drive to the store and then refrigerate the milk, and then they waste a lot of it, and then they dispose of the milk. And at all these stages in life cycle, you have emissions, and this is part of the inventory. You go through and you figure out how much benzene was emitted, how much arsenic was emitted. Of course, no farmer is emitting benzene and arsenic, but when you trace back to the production of the fertilizer, you'll always find interesting little things popping up. So it's not just what's happening on farm, which is a little bit, I think sometimes this slide can be misleading because it looks like it's just what's happening on the farm, and yes, you're looking across the life cycle. But in a true LCA, you're looking all the way back to think about how was the tractor manufactured, how was the rubber for the tires manufactured. So it's integrating across that whole system. And I've highlighted here emissions coming from these going to impacts, and this is another difference, another angle that I'm bringing here. Hopefully it'll be interesting. Instead of just talking about the volumes of water, we're talking about impacts associated with that. And I'll be talking about water and nutrients a little bit, nutrients to a lesser extent. And I've finally highlighted the field in bold here because a lot of stuff happens on the field when we're talking about water and nutrients. You can, if you dig into the life cycle inventory, you can find phosphorus and nitrogen associated with these later stages, but the majority is at the field. Okay, so this study is actually building on a greenhouse gas study that was done a couple years ago, published more recently. This work, I should say, has all been supported by the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. And so this study was one of the first U.S. granular studies of greenhouse gas emissions associated with milk production. So we've got our life cycle stages here, basically. These are the same stages in the legend here that we saw before. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. A lot of people know that when you're talking about greenhouse gases, that the enteric emissions and the manure management are big emitters of methane, which has a large carbon or global warming potential. Feed production, which is this green color, you could kind of add up these three bars, and you'd wind up with something on the order of those enteric and manure bars. So feed production is important for greenhouse gases. The other interesting thing, the reason I wanted to show this, is that we've got greenhouse gas emissions associated with the entire life cycle, whereas with water and nutrients, it's really more at the field. So one thing that was interesting about this study is that it brought a degree of spatial resolution. Dr. Thoma sent out massive, I don't know how many surveys, thousands of surveys, and got about 550, if I recall, back. And this is a distribution of the responses he received by farm size. And then this graph we have coming up, the black line is this cumulative milk production. So got a range of farms represented, which was pretty neat. And he knew where the farms were operating. So we suddenly had information about feed in the southeast versus the northwest. And this allowed us to start thinking about spatial aspects. So we built on that LCA. So we built on greenhouse gases and really focused on land use, human health, ecotoxicity, water, and nutrients. And again, I'm talking about the last two because those two especially have very interesting spatial characteristics. I'm not going to list all the sources. I'm happy to talk to you and send you whatever documentation you want. But largely, the information comes from the USDA, from the Census of Agriculture, and from the Farm Ranch Irrigation Survey, and some other sources. So water and nutrients are interesting. Here's a little graph. We'll come back to this later, so don't worry about it. But it just shows this is the residence time of phosphorus emitted to water, according to a model that we built for this a few years ago. And the range, I didn't even put the color bars up there, but just to, there's a range of several orders of magnitude here between emissions that happen in the Great Lakes states versus being on the coast. So spatial location, which is redundant, location is really important. And you get these large variations in, say, the residence time of phosphorus, which is highly correlated to the residence time of water. And that's no surprise. So before we talk more about water, I want to talk a little bit about blue, green, and gray water. We heard about that yesterday for those that weren't here, or at least just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm talking about blue water is water that is available for you to extract from a surface water body or a groundwater body, essentially. Green water is water that has fallen or is stored in the unsaturated zone. And gray water is a sort of conceptual dilution water. If you have a pollutant, you need to add a certain amount of water to dilute it to an acceptable level. So right now, at least for this portion of the talk, I'm going to focus on blue and green water and leave gray water aside. And I'm really focusing on blue water. So here's an interesting difference, and I hope we can talk about this later. In this context, in the LCA community, people really focus on blue water as consumed water, water that you have extracted from a reservoir, applied to your field, and it's evapotranspirated and it's gone. I'll show some data in a minute to actually look at those numbers for corn. But the question of whether water that is applied to a field actually leaves the reservoir or the watershed or whatever your area of analysis is an interesting one, and I don't think it's clear that it necessarily does. In this study, we assumed that water that was applied to field was consumed. Part of that is consumed in the crop when you ship it away, and part of it evapotranspirates, and it's a question about where it comes back down, whether or not it's actually been consumed. We did not consider green water as consumed water. So if you're growing corn, and you'll see this, I guess we can just go to the slide. If you're growing corn, and this is 20 states, this is the liters of water consumed per kilo of dry matter of corn grain. This is the top 20 states, so you can come down. Massachusetts would be over here on the right somewhere with very low liters consumed because in our model, the amount of water necessary to grow that corn is mostly rainfall, and you don't have a lot of consumed extracted water. So this is a difference in sort of approach and philosophy that I think is worth exploring a little bit. So the interesting thing about corn, and this is from the Farm Ranch Irrigation Survey, the FRIS data, is that we get 2 orders of magnitude variation for growing corn in the US, up to about 1,000 liters per kilo. Now the nice thing is we don't have a lot of corn production in Utah, or else we'd be in trouble. So we can look at this for a lot of different feeds. Really quickly, we based on that survey data, we broke up the country into these 5 regions, and you can see with color codes here, all of our sort of major crops for the cows. And with all of these, there's a lot more water required to grow them out west, which is no surprise. So this is again saying that where you're doing something really matters. And this is something that hasn't been explored, I think, at this scale so much, at least in the LCA community. So that was inventory. How much water did you use? The other thing that I think is a little bit different, instead of talking about volumes only, is to talk about impacts and the repercussions of using that water. So here we're showing a graph of water consumed, and again, that's blue water, versus water availability. And this Pfister paper from 2009 created this sigmoidal function to describe sort of how stressful is it to use that water in this situation. If you're using a liter and there's a liter available and only a liter available, that's a problem. If you're using a liter and there's thousands of liters available, that's much less stressful. So they conceived of this water stress index as a way to relate use to an impact. And it's clearly not an impact on ecosystems or humans. It's much more conceptual, but it's moving in that direction. And there's recently been other papers that have actually created human health and ecosystem impacts for water use. In the US, the human health impacts from using water are not very interesting. We're grateful to have relatively abundant water, and we rarely have people that are suffering from lack of water in this country. But that is an interesting question in other parts of the world. So the impact that I'm talking about today, at least for water, is this water stress. It just sort of tells you if you're using water in this area and there's not a lot of water available, you should watch out. So these are our two pieces. We've got inventory and impact. And we put them together in what was kind of a neat way using a variety of matrices. So bear with me, we'll walk through this counterclockwise, and it should all make sense at the end. So we start off with R for our rations, which tells you in a given area how much corn or whatever crop do you need to have to produce a kilo of milk. We then figure out how much corn is produced in one area versus consumed in another. And I wish Stanley were here. I'm still looking for him. We need to talk about, he was doing this with his embedded water trade across the US. So anyhow, we have some data for that as well to suggest if I'm using corn in Massachusetts, the majority has come from states 1, 2, 3, versus if I use corn in California, the majority has come from states X, Y, Z. We then have from our FRISC data this information about how much water it takes to produce a kilo. And then we have our what's called a characterization factor, which is that water stress. If I use water here, how much stress is induced here? Now the neat thing about this is that we can start multiplying these matrices together, and these are all state-based matrices, so we're keeping track of what's happening in each state. If we multiply these two together, we can talk about how much water stress is there to produce corn in a given region. If we multiply that product by the sort of national distribution, we can figure out how much water stress is there to consume corn in Massachusetts, and that's tracing it all the way back to wherever the corn came from. And finally, we can put the milk in there and talk about how much water stress there is to produce a kilogram of milk. And this allows us, again, to keep track of what's happening in each state, and we'll see that in a minute. So the water in competition, which is sort of an impact, is the product, and I'm showing here not in matrix form, but in map form, water consumption versus the water stress. So here's water consumption per kilo of corn. We saw this as a bar chart before. Here's the water stress index on the right, which is, again, how much water are you competing with people, or how many people are you competing with water? How many people are you competing for use of water? And you put these together, and you get water in competition due to corn production. And this is at sort of a state level, so we can see it's not surprising that Utah had a very high water consumption to produce a kilo of corn. Utah also has very high water stress, so it's not surprising that some of these western states really pop out as some of the most impactful for production of corn. What's interesting is if we put this together with national corn production, which is another matrix that I didn't really show, here's the graph that we just saw. This is the water competition for kilo of corn. If we combine this with the production of corn, we end up with poor Nebraska being right on the fringe of both of these sort of tough areas. So here, Nebraska's on the edge of the areas where there's a lot of competition for water use to produce corn. Nebraska is also producing a fair amount, and then we wind up with Nebraska sort of right in that hot spot at the national level. So if you were to take a kilo of corn that was, again, representative of production in the various states proportionally, you would find the majority of water stress came from Nebraska. Another way to look at this, and here are the numbers that sort of nationally, there's a large, about 53 liters consumed per kilo of corn. The competition is less because some of that corn is produced in areas where there's irrigation happening. Wow. All right. So we can look at this graphically, and we'll see a few of these graphs. I'm going to walk through this really quickly, and then we can breeze through the others. On the x-axis, we're looking at corn grain production. So we've got Illinois, Iowa, et cetera, big corn producers. And on the y-axis is basically the result we saw from the previous slide, which is the liters in competition per kilo of corn produced. So again, Utah and Arizona are way up here with high water requirements for corn and high stress. And the neat thing is combining these two, the area of this box is proportional sort of to the national impact. and we've ranked them here according to the areas of those boxes. So Nebraska, you can see, even though it has certainly not the highest stress nor the highest production, is one of the higher stress inducers at the national level. All right, that was corn. We had all these other crops, and we can put those all together, and voila, there it is. So here's water stress for milk production at the national level. So instead of corn, we're talking about milk production here. California is a big milk producer, Idaho, Texas to some degree, and Wisconsin's down here producing a large fraction of national milk, but on the y-axis, they don't have much water stress the way we've been defining it, which again is that blue water, not the green water. Again, these are ranked according to by area, so the California, which is over to the left, is the largest source of water stress for milk production. Not necessarily the highest, and it actually is the biggest producer of milk, but that's not necessarily why it's at that high area spot. It's at that intersection between inventory and impact. We can break this down by crops, and given the time, I won't do this except to say that in these western states, this red is corn silage, and the green is alfalfa hay, and according to our crop transportation models, these are crops that tend to be produced within the region or within the state, as opposed to corn, which is a national commodity. So if you're producing milk out in the west where you're growing a locally produced crop, you're using water. And so these contribute to a large fraction of that water impact. All right. One nice thing about the matrix approach is that we can track what's happening by where the impact happens and sort of who causes the impact. And here, inducer could really be producer. The producer of milk is the one who causes the corn grain to be grown, who causes the alfalfa to be grown. So these are ranked according to this red bar, which is the inducing state, and this is at the national level again. So California induces a fair amount of water stress, but they don't receive all of the water stress that they induce, whereas Nebraska does not induce, is not producing that much milk, but they receive a fair amount of water stress. So this is an interesting perspective, and you can also trace this back to where the emission happens, who's receiving the impact of the emission, which is a lot more interesting for things like nutrients, where the place of the emission is not necessarily the same as the place of the impact. That's for alfalfa silage, which is all local, so the bars are the same. If we go out to the full life cycle stage, so we've been just looking at the field, but if we zoom back out to the full life cycle, where we've got milk production, processing, packaging, retail, et cetera, again, all the impact for water is happening on the field. There's certainly little bits of water being used throughout the rest of the life cycle. So this is a very different picture than the greenhouse gas. All right, so this is just to say that the sum of averages is not the same as the average of sums or sum of products, however you like to say it. But if you just take sort of average water stress and average rations throughout the country, you wind up with a different number for water stress than if you actually account for it spatially. All right. I'll just say a little bit about gray water and then wrap up in the interest of time. LCA tries to model impacts, and this is what I've sort of said, that bringing in this impact, this characterization factor, is different than just talking about a virtual volume. And I think they're both valid, and they're both interesting. So LCA, if you're careful, you can actually start to sort of but compare impacts that are from eutrophication versus toxicity of pesticides on ecosystems or on human health. And as I understand it, any gray water volume, if you're talking about diluting water to a certain level, you have some sort of threshold in mind, some concentration you're trying to achieve. So I think it's embedded in there too. But there is work going on right now to sort of improve these models. And so if any of you are interested in eutrophication or acidification, please come talk to me later, and I'd like to tap your brain for your knowledge and bring you into this life cycle working group. Okay, so we did similar work for nutrients. This is from a very nice data set, the National Nutrient and Soil Carbon Loss Database, showing that this is across all pathways and all crops, or corn rather. We tend to have high nutrient loss in certain areas of the country versus others. No surprise there. I'm going to zoom through this, I really apologize. But the point is, and this is at the watershed level instead of the state level, when we put it all together, we could do a similar analysis for phosphorus and nitrogen, and we can start to compare these with water. So here are our US watersheds, and we've got in blue a water stress index. We've got in green phosphorus impacts that are happening in freshwater. And we've got, and these are induced, not the location of the impact. And we've got in red or salmon the nitrogen-related eutrophication impacts. And so you can start to see across the country where certain areas are sort of more impactful than others. And as Marty Matlock, who was on that initial greenhouse gas study, said, a lot of this work is really just quantifying duh. So it's no surprise that water stress is bigger out west and that there's more, say, phosphorus eutrophication problems in the Mississippi area. But this puts a sort of picture frame around it. You can start to assess where are the issues, where do we need to pay attention, how can we improve? So I didn't talk about it a lot, but of course, and you all know this better than I do, climate, practices, what's happening on the farm really influences the yield, which has major implications for water nutrient loss and how much land it takes. All these factors go together to tell you how much impact you're causing when you're growing a kilo of whatever crop you're growing. I talked about the importance of spatial models. They don't really exist within LCA frameworks yet, so you kind of have to do them outside, offshore them, and then bring them in. Inventory and impact are really important, and resolution is important. We've done this at the state level, but it does need to be done at a higher level. I've sort of brushed broadly over Nebraska, but there are big differences in that state with where irrigation happens. I do want to point out that uncertainty in data and models is important, but this spatial uncertainty is also important. So even though I didn't show a lot of error bars, but some of these spatial variations are clearly happening, and it's important not to sort of wrap them all together with uncertainty in other pieces of your model. And this question of inducer, emitter, receiver is interesting. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and look forward to talking about this with you all later.
Thank you.